Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's session of the course The History of English Language and Literature. In continuation with the previous lecture, we begin looking at the Middle English period, and we begin with a lecture with this understanding that the Middle English period cannot be constructed in a single seamless continuum. It needs to be divided at least into two parts, the time before Chaucer and the period after Chaucer. If you have noticed in the title itself, today's lecture has got a subtitle, England before Chaucer. So, we begin with this inherent understanding that Chaucer is perhaps the most determinant figure in classifying Middle English into two, and also perhaps the most important literary figure and cultural figure in the whole of Middle English period. However, in today's lecture, we look at the period before Chaucer, trying to locate the Middle English period in a more holistic sense, looking at the other literary influences which began to shape Middle English language and Middle English literature even before the arrival of Chaucer. So, which is this period that we classify as Middle English? The exact dates are difficult to be stated because there is no exact date or a year in which Anglo-Saxon period or the Old English period came to an end and the Middle English period began. But however, for political convenience, it is easier to note down 1066 or the year of Norman conquest as the beginning of and the opening moment of Middle English period, because politically that was the time when the Anglo-Saxon dominance came to an end and the Normans took over England. And around the same time, significant changes came to be imparted into English language as well. So, in that sense, 1066 is one convenient date which can mark the inaugural moment of Middle English period. And also around 1100, it is generally considered that English began to assume an identity of its own. It began to lose its Germanic, Old English Germanic inflections, and the current form in which we know English began to emerge and evolve from the 1100s onwards. So, the language that we see during the Middle English period, it is not Old English, it is not the modern contemporary English either. It is a form of a blend of Old English and Norman English. In that sense, some historians even call the language of this period as an in-between language. But English during this time becomes more comprehensible, and the literatures and the literature of this period is easier to identify with than with that of the Old English text. And roughly, as we noted earlier, this period is from the Middle English period is from the 12th to the 15th century. In today's session, we will be looking only at the period till the beginning of Chaucer. At this point, it is also important to be stated that some historians consider Chaucer as the real starting point of English literature. So, in some sense that the works that we talk about in today's lecture, they are not of supreme importance in terms of literary analysis and literary criticism, but they only have a historical kind of interest in situating the events that led up to the emergence of Chaucer as the most important literary figure. With this understanding, we move on to look at the major milestones of the Middle English period. 1066 is obviously the year of the Norman conquest. And by 1215, we have a very politically defining moment which produced the Magna Carta, about which we will be hearing a little more about shortly. And around 1250, it said that French begins to lose its prominence due to the various other socio-political events, some of which we will be taking a look at in the later sessions. And it is also characterized by the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453, the details of which we shall be taking a look at when we talk about Chaucer's England. And 1362 marks a very important year in terms of the prominence that English language acquires. It is the year of the Statute of the Pleading, which ordered that henceforth all proceedings in the law courts should be in English instead of French. This period is also characterized by Black Death, the bubonic plague, which affected not just Britain but also many parts of Europe. And this is also significantly the era which saw the emergence of the middle class as a very prominent figure. And it's important to note that Europe was also undergoing radical changes during the Middle English period, and this was the time of the Holy Crusades as well. But we do find that England had participated only minimally in the Holy Crusades, but however, the literature of longing, the literature of love and about the beloved who's left behind, who's yearning for the soldier who's out at the war front, all of these themes get built into the literature of the times because of the influence of the Holy Crusades as well. It was also politically and religiously quite significant, but however, since the discussions on the Holy Crusades are beyond the scope of our course, we shall just leave it at that. And also to be highlighted is the point that around this period, England also outgrows the hostility between the native population and the invaders who were the Norman French. And in 1066, when the Norman French invaded Anglo-Saxons, there was a growing hostility for quite a long time, but by the end of the Middle English period, we find that it's no longer about foreign influences, it's no longer about fighting among themselves, but it's more about consolidating themselves as a nation and as a single linguistic unit. And let's take a quick look at what this even Magna Carta is. This is important because this was a very politically significant event that began to mark the ways in which England began to shape itself as a nation, and also even at a later point of time when England was talking about rights and the various ways in which it could negotiate between the rulers and the ruled, Magna Carta was a very determining factor. So this was the Great Charter of the Liberties, as many of us know about, and this was signed on 15th June 1215. It was drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury and was agreed to by King John, who was the ruler of England then. And this was in fact as a result of a growing rebellion from the barons, and this was signed to make peace between highly unpopular King John and a group of rebel barons. So in that sense, it's one of the earliest political negotiations that had taken place. And this also had a lot of implication for the commoners because it promised the protection of the church rights. It also involved the protection of barons from illegal imprisonment, so on and so forth. So it also ensured that the king could not act according to his whims and fancies, but he also had to put in place certain principles and certain and ensure that certain rights are available to the subjects, to the other rulers, so on and so forth. And Magna Carta is supremely important, and we choose to discuss this in this lecture because it became a part of English political life, and we begin to see that the literature of the times also reflected this kind of new freedom and the new secular ambience which was getting generated in England. And Magna Carta was incidentally renewed by each monarch one after the other. So in that sense, it assumed supreme political and civil importance. Now coming back to our main topic on Middle English literature. Middle English literature was a little more varied compared to the Old English literature. We noted that the Old English literature was mostly about war and about religion and about the trials of daily life. But with the Middle English period, we move a little ahead. It's certainly war literature occupies a major war literature continues to occupy a major part of literary writings. There is also religious literature in place. But in addition to this, we find a new kind of literature emerging which could be classified as romances. We need to understand romance in a rather broad sense. It's not just about love literature. It's also about knights and their quest for courtly love and the values of chivalry that they stood for. So in that sense, romance literature was mostly about the lives of knights and the kind of adventures that they embarked upon. So it was not, the romances had not yet got reduced into the love life between just two ordinary people. So alongside, we also find this local tradition of songs and ballads emerging. We do not have much evidence about the kind of songs and ballads that existed during that time, but mostly it was also transmitted through this oral tradition. And it's also difficult to date these ballads due to the same reasons. Some are even of the opinion that these ballads were prominent even during the Old English period, and they were just transmitted through this oral means from one generation to the other. And some of the important and the notable ballads which were orally transmitted even after the Middle English period were the songs which later came to be known as raw the song of Lord Randall, and some of the songs that celebrated the changing of the season. So, in this lecture we shall not be discussing much about this the oral tradition or the tradition of the songs and ballads. We shall be focusing mostly on war literature, religious literature and the romances which prevailed during that time, primarily because they were written down and they were not just based on the oral tradition. And another significant factor is that most of the works were anonymous. It has not yet become quite common for them to sign the works with their own name. So, in that sense no one took any kind of ownership to the works, and all literary works were considered as almost as public property. And books were very expensive during that time. Printing had not yet come into place and it was mostly copied. Manuscripts were available. That was a very expensive affair and not many could afford it. And London also emerges as a centre of politics, centre of trade and commerce, and also of culture and writing. And we also notice that most of the writers who gained prominence in Middle English period, they were living in London. It was also because London was the Norman capital soon after the Norman conquest. So, since London was more happening than the other parts of the country, many chose to migrate to London. They continued to build a more reputable literary career over there. And this is also the time when Oxford and Cambridge begin to be founded, and they also emerge as major centres of culture and language. Oxford was founded in 1167 and Cambridge in 1209. So, we begin to notice that these cultural artifacts and these institutions of repute were begin to be founded even as early as the Middle English period. Let us now take a detailed look at the various kinds of writings which were available during these centuries. We note that even when we take an entire century in hand, we have maybe a couple of works to talk about, worthwhile to talk about. So, in that sense, 12th century we have two major works, Omulum by Orm and another anonymous work, The Owl and the Nightingale. The work Omulum, it was more religious in nature. It could be loosely translated as an interpretation of the Bible. It was in that sense yet another attempt to bring Bible and the works of the Bible closer to the common people. And this was also significant in a historical sense because it traced the history of the English people from the Roman conquest onwards. So, in that sense this also threw glimpses of the local life and the transitions from one ruler to the other. So, historians continue to look at this work with a lot of interest. And this is also one of the first works and one of the earliest works to use poetic meter. And the other work, The Owl and the Nightingale, it was structured in quite an innovative way. It included arguments about various things of philosophical nature, things that concern daily life, and even about more profound things related to life in general. So, the arguments were structured in a very courtly style, and also it was more allegorical than many of the other works of that period. So, apart from these two major works, we do not have evidence for the other kinds of literature that flourished during the time apart from the oral literature of those period. And in 13th century, we also notice that the literary output begins to look a little more productive, a little more prolific compared to the previous century. And Layamon's Brut, which was arguably written in 1205, is perhaps the most important work other than the later works that came after the period of Chaucer. And this work was not purely literary in nature. This was in fact the historiography of Britain in the form of a poem, and this also draws attention to the fact that even history could be written in verse during those times, because verse was easier for people to memorize. It also gave them a way to make oral transmission easier. So, verse did not have the kind of limitations that now we talk about, because nowadays we know that predominantly any kind of historiography, for it to be written in verse, it is quite an unthinkable feat. In that sense, Layamon's Brut could be considered as a very significant work which could blend in together elements of history and elements of poetry together. And this is also the work in which we find the first appearance of King Arthur. We noted in one of the previous lectures that the legends of King Arthur is what made him more popular than the historical evidence of his own existence. So, we also find that Laymon's Brute tried to link older historical traditions with modern Englishness. So, in that sense we find that the common people, as well as in that sense we find that there is a lot we get to know about the Old English period and about the culture of those times from Laymon's Brute. And many historians talk about Laymon's Brute as the first voice in Middle English, especially in terms of language, because in this work we find that the use of English language is less conscious, it is more colloquial, and there is more use of idioms and proverbs. So, in a sense a more familiarity of the language could be found from Laymon's Brute onwards. And another significant work of this time is Wace's Arthurian Chronicles. Here we begin to note that King Arthur of the Old English times, he assumes supreme importance during this period, because we find him getting resurrected from all the other kinds of remnants of history. And this at the time we also find the popularization of Arthurian tales from not just from England but also from France. We find a lot of French ballads and French folk tales talking about King Arthur's legends, and many English writers also replicate that in their own writings in English. And there were also these two romances of which there is historical evidence, King Horn and Havelock the Dane, the authors of which remain unknown. And Roman de la Rose, or the Romance of the Rose, is considered as the most influential imported text of Middle English period. This was written in French. This is said to have had a profound influence on the writings in English and during the 13th century. It also is said to have laid the foundation for a particular kind of writing of romance to develop later in the 14th and 15th centuries as well. Another very important figure of the Middle English period is that of Geoffrey of Monmouth. He is said to have lived around 1100. He is said to have lived around 1100s. The exact dates are not yet known. The most important and notable work of Geoffrey of Monmouth is that of the History of the Kings of Britain. And though this work was highly popular, and many historians even rely on this work for getting a glimpse of the past, the cultural and social religious past, it is also said to be highly inaccurate. But what makes this work quite distinct is the fact that he is the one who popularized the legends of King Arthur. So, Geoffrey of Monmouth, we recalled even in one of the earlier sessions that he is actually, he lives through the legends recreated by Geoffrey of Monmouth. In fact, many of the things, many of the anecdotes attributed to King Arthur is from the works of Geoffrey of Monmouth. And he is also the one who made Excalibur popular, Excalibur being the legendary sword of King Arthur, who which is said to have had some magical powers as well. So, there are a lot of these stories about the Excalibur of King Arthur from the Middle English period onwards, and we know that Excalibur has come to signify a lot of things about the cultural heritage of England even in the contemporary. And the other notable figure is that of Robert Manning of Brun. He was also a monk as well as a chronicler, and it is also said that he was perhaps part of the canon during the times that he lived. And there are two works of notable repute, Handling Sin and Manning's Chronicle. And the Handling Sin is considered to be the first confessional manual in English literature. The nature of this confession could also be due to the religious tendencies that he had. And Manning's Chronicle was yet another work based on history, and again this was the story of England written in verse, and it said that it is extended through the reign of Edward I. And some even feel that Manning's Chronicle was not very original, that he had translated some bits of many Old English texts put together. In that sense, perhaps it is more or less a compilation or a translation of the Old English text as well. And what makes Manning quite different from the others is that in his own works we find a lot of biographical information about himself, and this is quite surprising because many writers were not used to talking about themselves. We also noted that many writers did not even bother to sign with their own names after the work was completed. In that sense, Manning shows commendable insight in talking about himself, his own life and his own surroundings, so that it becomes a useful historical tract in the later times. The 14th century, in the 14th century we find ourselves moving closer towards the life and works of Chaucer, and this is the period which is known as the period of the alliterative revival. Alliterative revival, as the term signifies, it's a resurgence of poetry with particular kinds of alliterations and rhymes built into it. And we do not find England going back from this period onwards. We do find that there is an increased interest and an increased attention being provided to poetry and other forms of literature. This is also the time when England prepares itself to produce greater classics, shows more attention and more interest in the other classics of Greek and Latin. And the notable feature of this time is the presence of a particular anonymous poet who has come to be known as the Pearl poet or the Gawain poet, based on a set of poems known as the Pearl poems, or based on the major work known as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This is also the best known Arthurian tale from the Middle English times. And the Pearl poet or the Gawain poet, he is also said to be a contemporary of Chaucer, Gower and Langland, about whom we will hear more about in the next session. And this century was more important because a sense of literature, a sense of national unity, a sense of national literature is getting emerged from this period onwards. How has it become possible for us to access all these Old English and Middle English texts? Perhaps one should be very thankful to this major figure, Robert Cotton. And most of these works that we talk about, whether it's an Old English text like Beowulf or Middle English texts like Gawain and the Green Knight, all these manuscripts have become accessible because they are present in this particular set known as Cotton Nero AX. And this was from a personal collection of this visionary figure known as Robert Bruce Cotton. He was quite a successful and a wealthy person who lived in the later 16th and early 17th century, who showed at most interest as a collector of medieval texts. He had a lot of interest in local history, and he was also a noted antiquarian of his times. So we find him collecting most of the original Old English and Middle English manuscripts which were available, and he is also said to have credited to have preserved them so that they did not go extinct in any way. In fact, about his manuscripts, historians feel that his collection outshone those of the crown, the church and the inns of the court. This is very important because, as we have noted earlier, most of the manuscripts and most of the literary collection was available either with the court or with the church. The monasteries were in charge of it most of the times, or it was with the inns of the court, which primarily comprised of the four institutions which together constituted the judiciary of those times. So, Robert Cotton is said to have had a collection which outshone all of these collections put together, and one should be very thankful to Robert Cotton for showing this kind of a passion to preserve these extant texts. And his grandson at a later point was quite kind enough to donate this entire set to the British Library, where it is still preserved. So, in many sense we also begin to note that the Middle English period and the Old English period is important, not just because of the efforts of the people who lived just during the time, but also because of the interest that posterity began to show in their works, and also because of the sense of national heritage which became all the more important in the later centuries. So, preserving an Old English text or a Middle English text was not just about preserving literature, but it was also about preserving a heritage which had been handed down. So, in that sense, one remains eternally grateful to many figures such as Robert Cotton, who perhaps did not live in the said age, but contributed to the age in many different ways than the ones who were living in these ages could ever even begin to think of or comprehend. Coming back to some linguistic aspects, there were four major dialects during this time. Southwestern, it had emerged from the Old English West Saxon. Southeastern, which emerged from the Old English Kentish, East Midland and West Midland, and also Northern. So, all of these dialects were in some form a continuation from the Old English language, from the Old English dialects. We also note that the two dialects, East Midland and West Midland, they had together emerged from the Old English Mercian, and in this context the East Midland dialect assumes more importance because this was the one who later became Chaucer's language. And since East Midland was spoken more in London and also it became the major literary vehicle of Chaucer, East Midland dialect is the one from which contemporary English is said to have emerged as well. So, there is also this fifth kind known as the northern dialect, and we find that almost all of these dialects were quite different from one another. It is said that even if they lived just 50 miles apart and if they spoke these different dialects, they were not comprehensible to one another. So, these dialects were almost like 5 different languages. But and each writer was quite free to use whichever dialect that he or she preferred, and the spellings and the grammar differed on the individual kind of uses, and it all depended on which spelling each author preferred to use. In some form, this is said to have got more standardized with Chaucer writing entirely in the East Midland dialect and also giving it a sense of reputation and more acceptance because it was mostly spoken in the city of London. In terms of dialectical differences, England begins to assert itself as a single national linguistic identity. This diversity does not affect in any way the evolution of language or the emergence of English into a single unit. And towards the time of Chaucer, we also find England moving towards more Englishness, and this is a kind of definition and the classification which has stayed on to define the rest of the centuries as well. And from this period, from the end of the 14th century and from the end of the 13th century onwards, we find England also ceasing to be a recipient of foreign influences. The Norman French influence had considerably got mitigated. England is more about native forces and the native influences. It is more organized as a nation, more conscious of her nationhood, and also they had emerged into a single racial and cultural unity, not taking into account the many things that differentiated them in terms of ethnic identities or in terms of linguistic and dialectical differences. And also at this point of time, we find that though England continues to receive a lot of influences from the neighboring countries and also from all kinds of cultural and linguistic imports from other languages, England begins to form her own kind of literature, her own kind of religion, begins to practice her own economic society, and also develops their own methods of war. So that makes the nation quite distinguishable in many ways, and we find the literature of the times beginning to reflect all of these elements in them. And with the advent of Chaucer, which we will begin to notice in the next session, we also notice that these native influences are more pronounced. There is a more English kind of writing which begins to emerge, about which we can discuss more about without relating them with the other kinds of influences. And this literary output and language of the Middle English times, we find it getting more consolidated towards the end of the Middle English period and with the advent of Chaucer. And at this point, it is very important to note that Anglo-Saxon language or the Old English language is almost like a dead foreign language now, and we do not find language going back to the roots of Anglo-Saxon tongue from this time onwards. The Norman French influence stays on. There are about 10,000 words, borrowed words from French, which becomes part of English language. In many ways, England acquires a new stature by the time Chaucer comes into the scene. So, let us wind up this session by giving a brief prelude towards the next session, which is going to be about the age of Chaucer. Many historians feel that Chaucer is the real starting point of English literature, and so much so that whatever we discussed in today's lecture is completely overshadowed by the presence of Chaucer. And with the advent of Chaucer, many later historians feel that he is the first of our really national poets. Some consider him as the father of English poetry, and he is generally considered as the opening moment of English literature proper. So, with this we come to an end to this today's session, and we have noted how the Old English period and the Middle English period were quite important and significant in shaping in laying the foundations of English literature and shaping how literature would be in the forthcoming centuries. So, we look forward to seeing you in the next session with the age of Chaucer. Thank you for listening.